So, as I said earlier, welcome both to the colleagues who are in the room, and we have a very nice full house today, and we're really looking forward to this talk by Anna Growe, who has joined us from Castle as one of our IAS visiting fellows this year, and we very much welcome you. And we've had a little opportunity to talk to Anna already this morning, which has been very lovely. As those of you who are familiar with the IAS know, it is the university's hub for international visiting fellows. And also we like to think a key space where a range of colleagues from different disciplines across the university have an ability to come and meet. And it's one of our great pleasures that it is such an interdisciplinary space, and that we welcome colleagues from a whole range of different areas who talk about all sorts of wonderful and exciting research. And we have really interesting and collegial conversation around those. And we are very much looking forward to this conversation today in light of that. I'm going to turn over to my colleague, John Harrison, who is going to do a more official introduction to Anna, who will then speak. John.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marcia, and good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I've been asked to say a few words by way of welcome to Anna. So firstly, I'll do the formal bit, then I'll do the informal in terms of a little bit history kind of connection that I have to Anna and Anna's connection to Loughborough and geography. So Anna is currently based at Castle University, where she is a professor as of Wednesday. So to celebrate, she decided. So by way of celebration, she spent it in Loughborough. So we're very delighted and honoured. So I did all the organisation to welcome and to enable Anna to come to spend a week with us here in Loughborough. Anna's background is as a spatial planner. So Andrew, the planning here at Loughborough, based in Dortmund. You've been via Freiburg and Heidelberg, which is close to two people in this room in particular, Michael and Heike. And as I say, as of Wednesday, you're now based out of Castle University. In terms of the connection to geography, Anna visited us in 2010 for 6 months as a visiting doctoral researcher, where one of these seminars had quite a significant number of consequences. So Anna came to work with the Globalisation of World Cities Research Group that's based in geography, particularly working with Peter Taylor, but also other colleagues in Cork who were here at the time, and some of who are still here. Now, my kind of personal connection to Anna in that presentation is that Anna included a map on the first slide, which in hindsight, hopefully was a good thing for Anna. It's certainly a good thing for me, because Anna did a 50-minute presentation where the majority of the focus was on kind of the Cork research and some of the work that she's going to present today. But as all geographers know, we all like a map. And I saw the map and saw really clear connections to some research that I was doing. So unfortunately for Anna, I guess in the sense that she came to work with Peter Taylor and the Great and the Good at Loughborough, she actually ended up writing a paper with me as a side project, and then we wrote another paper a couple of years later. On that note, it's been really great to see Anna's kind of career development to the point where she's now reached professor. I'm delighted to listen to your presentation today, which is going to reveal to colleagues what you probably already know, that Anna is a fantastic researcher, and the work that we did together was very much Anna's work, and I was just clinging on for dear life because Anna's presentation is going to be fantastic. Also, last thing but not least, if you look at the title, the word region is there. It's written 3 times. Most colleagues in London know that the word region is what gets me excited, so I can't wait to hear what we're going to talk about today. So over to you, Anna. Hope you haven't invited you.
Thank you very much for the kind words and for the invitation to stay again in Loughborough for 1 week. I'm really happy to be here again. Unfortunately, I have a bit of a cold, so I hope you can understand me, but I feel it's getting a little bit better. So we'll just go through the presentation and hope it works out until the end. Okay, I brought something about regionalization today with the topic into the regionalization processes in European metropolitan regions, because my original focus when I came here to Loughborough first were metropolitan regions. And I'm interested in what is happening in metropolitan regions. How do the city centers and the surrounding in metropolitan regions relate to each other? And this is something I want to present today. No, I can use this one. Okay, so I want to give a little bit of a background of regionalization and also of metropolitan functions. And then I want to give two different examples, one from Germany and one from Europe. So two papers where I want to present some of the content here. And to go right into the topic is talking a little bit about regionalization. So what do I mean when I talk about regionalization? So be a little bit more abstract at the beginning. So when I talk about regionalization, I'm thinking of developments that are stretching out somehow into the region, and also explicitly for John, region is not kind of really defined here. So there are a lot of possibilities to think of what the region actually can be. For empirical purposes, later in the paper or in the presentation, I will show what we have used for regions. But I think it's important to think beyond the urban core. So we have a description or different understanding. So just to give some ideas here, for example, from SOJA, so that we might have a development leading back from suburbanization. So that means a development happening really in close proximity to the city center, more in terms of commuting distances, more back into the region, where we have a development of urban functions wide into the region, meaning that the whole region becomes more urban instead of just the urban spilling over the administrative borders maybe of the city. So what we are talking about, or what I'm thinking about, is an enrichment of regional hinterlands with economic functions and an enlargement of dense agglomerations beyond the traditional core centers. And the questions associated with regionalization are, of course, what developments are included. Do we can differentiate different functions of some might be more regionalized than others or not? And how far do the developments stretch out? Do we see that some of the functions stick close to the urban core, or do they all stretch out similarly wide into the region? And of course, basic question, what are drivers of regionalization? Maybe to give a hint on that, the last question I cannot finally discuss today, but we are open to discuss principal reasons and drivers at the end. So I was talking at the beginning of metropolitan functions. So what actually are metropolitan functions? It is a concept that is hugely or strongly rooted in some German literature, with the idea of identifying different functions that are measuring urbanity, or better, more specific, metropolitanity. So to develop an idea of different functions that would focus on the biggest cities, the more metropolitan cities. And if you have then a set of indicators or functions that will point to these huge metropolitan areas, you can use them to identify like the most metropolitan places. We had a set of, or an idea of different functions, also in the literature, for example, so-called control functions, which are also well known in the international literature with regard, for example, to business and finance, but also to policy topics. Then we also had the idea of an innovation function, focusing on research and development in the private sector, but also on science and research, like more university-based. Also the gateway function, referring to exchange of different things, can be people, can also be goods. For example, market volume with regard to trade fairs, or also measure of transportation. And these were the original three metropolitan functions, but they had a quite economic bias. So this was object to critique. And then after some time, a fourth function was developed too. So this was the symbolic function, hinting on cultural aspects, economy and media, and also on arts, culture and architecture. And we were using this set of indicators in a research I will present later. Here in the German case study, so now the question is, how do these four functions lay out spatially? So originally, these functions have been developed to identify the most metropolitan places. So that would mean you would expect these functions to show up in core cities, in more bigger cities. But the question is, can we see some of these functions also emerging in smaller towns or maybe even in rural areas in regions surrounding the metropolitan areas? So we used free classification of urban regions, very popular in Germany because this is developed by the BDSR, which is a German institute for responsible for doing spatial analysis. We did, however, differentiate the inner area of these pre-classified 62 urban regions. So what you see here on the map is in gray, the core cities, and then we have the hinterland differentiated in the complementary area, which is usually the area closest to the core city, and then the closer commuter area, and the more remote commuter area. And you also can see that because it's based on also on accessibility, that it is depending on the actual size of the region and how the region is integrated. So we have some areas where we don't have complementary area, and in some other regions we have a larger complementary area. To give a little bit more an idea of what we actually measured with these metropolitan functions, is we used this idea of the 4 different metropolitan functions. So the control function, the innovation function, the gateway function, and the symbolic function. And we have then subfunctions, so 2 subfunctions for the control, 2 subfunctions for the innovation, and so on. And we also had a number of indicators actually to identify the location of these. I will not go through all the indicators right now, but we also had the locations on the municipality level of these different indicators for 2 points in time, so we could compare the development over time. Well, this one. What we also could do with the different indicators is we could, by a weighting process, add them all up to one metropolitan index, so where we put all the indicators together in one big metropolitan index, or we could choose different indicators and then separate them according to 8 sub-indices. And you will see some of the results for that. So now the question is, of course, how regionalized are these metropolitan functions? So here we have the starting point, 2008-10. This is just result of the availability of the indicators. So we choose indicators between 2008 and 2010. And what you can see here is in the triangles, the orange part is the indicators located in the hinterland, the metropolitan functions. And in the gray part, the metropolitan index of the core city. And obviously, as should be expected, because it were metropolitan functions, most of them are really located in the core cities, especially, for example, Berlin is a very interesting example. You have only a really small orange triangle here. But then you have other cities, Munich, for example, here also Frankfurt, Stuttgart, but also here, for example, some smaller city regions, this is Bielefeld, where you have a really huge part of the orange triangle. So meaning that there is a huge part of the metropolitan functions located somewhere in that city regions are not located in the core city, but somewhere else in the hinterland. I will just go back to the, here, meaning here, for example, in Munich, all the gray triangles would be located here in the gray part of the core city, and all the orange part of the triangle would be located somewhere else in that region. Okay, so this is first side for a starting point. There is a huge concentration of that metropolitan indices in the core city, but there are already some regions where we have a more distributed situation. And now if we look at the change, so we see different circles laid over each other. So what we see, for example, now again is in gray, the change within the metropolitan core, and in orange, the change of the hinterland. So for example, here, most obviously in Frankfurt, the orange circle is really huge, much bigger than the circle, the gray circle. meaning that the change of the location happened mostly in the region and not in the core city. So the development in the hinterland was much stronger than in the core city. In other cases, for example, in Berlin, where you do not see an orange circle at all, the whole development takes place in the core city. So we see here a very interesting diversion in the city regions in Germany. So we have some city regions, for example, Berlin, with a very highly concentrated situation at the beginning, and then even no regionalization process visible here. But then we have, especially here along the Rhine axis, a number of regions where we have really huge orange circles, meaning that we have a lot of development going on in the regions and not in the core cities. Also, Stuttgart here, for example, is a very interesting example because it is a very prosperic region, but yeah, the orange circle, meaning the regional development, is much stronger than the development in the core city. And now I have talked at the beginning that we do not have only one metropolitan index in total, but we can also subdivide into the 8 subfunctions. If we look now at the different subfunctions, we can see very interesting patterns. So for example, here maybe you have to check out these colors. We have in blue again the more business orientated, the control function. Then we have the red and orange innovation, the green one, the gateway, and the violet color is the symbolic function. What we see here is the bigger the pie, the more important is this subfunction into the regional development. So because you see here on that map, we excluded the city centers because the development there in some parts, for example, in Berlin, would overshadow all the other parts. So we just kept out the core cities for this analysis and ended up with interesting pie charts. For example, in Frankfurt, you can see that the regional development is based mainly on the gateway functions and also on the research development in the private sector. So these are the subfunctions that are most likely to happen in Frankfurt or that are happening in the region. And interestingly, if you look at all the regions displayed here, you see that these color here, this light orange, a pie is probably the biggest pie in all of the regions, apart, for example, here from that one where we have arts, culture, and architecture really developing out into the region. So the science and development in the private sector is the subfunction which is kind of the strongest driver of regionalization processes. And then we have also some exemptions from that rule, for example, also here in Stuttgart, where we have business and finance also moving out of the city. Maybe not moving out is the wrong description, but kind of additionally developing in the region. So what we did ask ourselves is also, what does it mean for the different circles within the region or the different distances within the region? We have the complementary area at that area which is closest to the city, then the closer commuter area, and then the remote commuter area. And what you can see here also is that in most subfunctions, the complementary area is the area that is the one that benefits most from the regionalization process, hinting on that it's not like stretching really far outside into the region, but it's really more a spillover process maybe from the development in the core cities. But in some other functions, especially here again, research and development in the private sector, here again, we have the complementary area as the highest benefiter of these development. But also, for example, the closer commuter area and even the remoter community area here have a high benefit of that development. Transportation is very interesting because here we see a clear differentiation between the closer commuter area and the remote commuter area and the complementary area. This is mostly a result of airports, for example, being located obviously not in the city center themselves, but in the neighboring municipalities. So the transportation subfunction is a little bit tricky, but the other subfunctions where you have this strong development out into the region are really interesting for further research. So what we did then is also a more detailed view into the spatial structure now for these 8 subfunctions. So here you have to keep in mind that we did not display the core city. So we have the smallest circle here now representing the complementary area, then the middle circle representing the closer commuter area, and then the outer circle representing the remote commuter area. And what you can see is now that in some regions, for example, in Frankfurt, you can see that market volume is developing in all kinds of areas. So it's really stretching out into the region. However, one has to keep in mind, I will skip back for that, just here, that the biggest driver of regionalization here is the research and development. Market volume also is important, but compared to this, I mean, you cannot, the size of the pie here does not mean the importance of the function. It just shows the spatial reference of the function. So even if this is not stretching out into the remote commuter area, the overall importance of research and development for the regionalization process in total is much bigger than the importance of market volume. And what you can also see is very interesting, that there are some regions, for example, Düsseldorf, where you have mostly directly neighboring municipalities. This is also a result of Düsseldorf here being located in a really dense agglomeration. So if you would then go further away, you would end up in another core city. So just like a spatial effect of that larger agglomeration, which makes it a little bit tricky to analyze this regionalization process in the huge polycentric regions, which is something that also the Gork people can tell some stories about. But if you look then at the bigger monocentric or slightly polycentric region, it's really interesting, for example, with Munich here, showing a huge development for also for policy, but also for research and development, again, in the remote commuter area. Also Frankfurt here, for example. And then we displayed only the top 10 urban regions with the strongest regionalization process here in this map. And this is really interesting because it shows also some really small city regions. So for example, Bielefeld, being also in the maps beforehand, in the first maps that I showed with the strong orange triangle at the start, still a process of regionalization so far out in the region. And also, for example, Reutlingen, which is south of Stuttgart, and Heilbronn, north of Stuttgart, building up like a regionalization, regional agglomeration, something like that you could probably discuss further. So what are the primary results about this analysis? So for the first questions, do all metropolitan functions stretch out similarly? We can definitely say that some subfunctions are more regionalized than others, especially the R&D and private sector, and also transportation do regionalize a lot, but transportation is mostly a consequence of like finding, for example, big locations for airports, which is not possible in core cities. However, R&D and private sector, like this economic development, this is not necessarily struck by large land areas you need for that. You could do that also in the city center, but it's done mostly in recent times also in the region. And how far do metropolitan functions stretch out? So what we can see is that the growth in the private sector is happening in nearly all 3 hinterland types, but the surrounding area directly to the urban core is still the one that has like the most benefit of all the regionalization processes, but it's growing out more and more into the regional hinterland. And with regard to that question, what is the driver of that? We did some additional analysis, but not with metropolitan functions. That's why I did not include the maps about that. We did do it with occupational data. And what we could find out is that, for example, in these more polycentric regions like Stuttgart, for example, and also associated with the ones more to the north and to the south of Stuttgart, I will go back to that, here Heilbronn and especially also Reutlingen, we found that an increase, for example, of occupation happened in a lot of existing smaller cities, meaning that there is a spillover not in a kind of suburbanization way, but more a spillover in terms of occupations and maybe newly built firms or new developed firms into existing smaller cities, and thus benefiting from the proximity to the core city in a huge agglomeration, but being they're not located directly into that huge core of that agglomeration, but into a like certain proximity to that, but still having a kind of an urban core. This is interesting, especially here, because here we have also a number of smaller universities located in smaller cities, which might serve then as these anchor points for the regionalization process. So this is with another data set, so I did not include it here, but it kind of motivated us to do some other research on another level with small and medium-sized cities. So that will be the next topic I want to show you. I brought also, to be not only German focused here in that presentation, I wanted to bring also some examples from Europe. And here we have like slightly a change of perspective. So while in the other example, I was focusing on the question, or we were focusing, I did that research together, the examples from Germany with a colleague from Dortmund, Katja Volkmann. And the next example, the example from Dortmund is also done with a colleague from Dortmund, Thomas Terfrüchte. So we did that, not focusing on urban regions and seeing then how the development within the region changed. But in that example from Europe now, we focused on small and medium-sized cities and tried to compare development of small and medium-sized cities within and outside metropolitan areas, so that you could compare different, like maybe pathways or situations of cities of similar size in two different spatial settings. Okay, having said that, I will move on to the next example. Maybe try to push on. And I want to give an additional background information or theoretical information. What also influenced our question was a question of whether cities in close proximity to a huge agglomeration or to a bigger city are influenced positively or negatively by that city. There's a discussion in theory going on. I have condensed it shortly on that slide to give some basic information. Discussing the topic of borrowing size or agglomeration shadow, and maybe to combine it very shortly here for that presentation. The idea of borrowing size is that small and medium-sized towns in agglomeration areas can draw on more agglomeration advantages than towns of similar size when they are not located in an agglomeration, because they would benefit from other urban functions that are not located in the own city, but in another neighboring city maybe. On the other hand, so that would mean that there is a benefit from being a small city in close location to a bigger city, because you could profit from the proximity to the bigger city. On the other hand, if you're a smaller city close to a bigger city, there could also be the disadvantage that if, for example, a firm decides to move through into a metropolitan region, Why should it choose a smaller city if it has access to all the agglomeration advantages in the biggest city immediately? So that could mean that there is an agglomeration shadow because there is no need for any function to be located in a smaller city if it can go directly into the bigger city as such. So just to give you that idea, I will follow up with that later on another slide. Here we also used metropolitan functions. We had a slightly different database we could use, so the functions are a little bit different structured, but the basic idea is the same. So we have the metropolitan function of politics, of economy, of science, of transport, and of culture, with some different ideas of subfunctions, and there's also a whole list of indicators lying beyond that. And I brought this map too because what we could use, and I have to emphasize this with a lot of gratitude, we could use the original data set developed by the BBSR for SAM analysis they were doing in 2010. This is like a little con because the data set is already a bit on not the youngest one, it's a bit old, but we will try to proceed with that. So what they did was they were locating the indicators for the different metropolitan functions in whole Europe, so which was really a lot of work. They tried to identify, for example, universities, banks, and a lot of other stuff on the LAU level in whole Europe. And obviously what you can see on this map, which is produced by the BBSR, it hints out the biggest cities because that was what the data set was developed to do. So to identify the biggest cities, and also what you could do is to compare, for example, the share of the different functions in one city. So you could see if one city is more structured by economy, or more by science, or more by politics. So you could compare the shares of these different metropolitan functions in, for example, the capital cities of each country or so, something like that. So we were able to use the original data set, but what we wanted to do, we wanted to compare the small and medium-sized towns with the question of, like I said in the first part of the presentation, can we see some of these originally really urban functions also in other locations? Obviously, we would not expect them to be in the same scale like in the bigger cities, but there still could be some city types that have more than others. So what we did, we got the original data set, and then this was a little bit tricky because the original data set was not matched with population data, wasn't necessary for the original question. We had to match it. This was a lot of work. And this is also now resulting in missing out UK, because after the Brexit, no data is provided anymore by Eurostat. Unfortunately, also Ireland has to be left out because the municipality level is not matching with the other ones in Europe. So we have to focus on all the gray areas here. And what we have now is a data set containing over 90,000 municipalities with each population data and also information about the metropolitan functions in the areas. Sorry, I will not go into detail for all of the cities. We just started. The data set is still new, so we are still happy to have a lot of time to play with it. But I want to present something for that small and medium-sized towns here. So we have the small-sized towns, 5,000 until 20,000, and then we have medium-sized towns differentiated in small and big medium-sized towns, so 20 to 50,000 and 50 to 100,000 inhabitants. And this is the total number of cities included in our data set. And then we could also differentiate these cities, whether they are located outside the metropolitan area or inside the metropolitan area. So we marked the metropolitan areas here in darker gray on this map. So, and we also displayed here at this like starting map, all the small and medium-sized towns. So the little triangles, circles, and squares. And you can see also Obviously, not all of them have a positive metropolitan index. So there are some of the cities that do not have any metropolitanity at all, but some of them have. And just to give you a short insight, again, of what city types and also what metropolitan function is maybe more relevant for the smaller cities, because we have to keep in mind the metropolitan functions were originally developed to depict metropolitan areas. So the question is still, can we find some of that metropolitan aspects in the smaller cities? And yes, we can. Not of like super huge amounts, like we find them obviously in the huge capitals, but at least a little bit. And when we compare, then here maybe have a first look on the different functions here. We see here a total of 50% of all that science is also located in the small and medium-sized cities. So for example, especially you can see here, for example, an increase of percentage, meaning an importance of that cities as locations for this function. So for 41% of these bigger medium-sized cities have at least a little bit metropolitanity in the science function. So the data set is arranged in a way that if you have like, if you're above 0, then you would show up in this graph or in this diagram as part of that share. So not depicting whether you have super high, a super high function in, or how could I find a super high number value for that function, or more like only a little bit value for that function, just is whether it is positive or not positive. So, and what we can see is that politics do not play a role at all in the small and medium-sized functions. So we have kind of close to 0 for all of them. It's just so few cities that do display political functions on the small and medium-sized level. Interestingly, some of them are capitals, for example, from the very, for example, Andorra, a super small country with a super small capital. So that would picture up as a capital in that category here from 50 to 100,000 inhabitants. But this is not the normal type you want to grasp with that analysis. On the other hand, for example, 41% of the bigger medium-sized cities do display a value with regard to science. And also for culture, for example, we have high values here for the bigger medium-sized cities. So culture and science also could be taken as examples where we could look a little bit deeper in where they're located, also apart from the really big cities. And then we have to take into consideration the borrowed size and agglomeration shadow topic that I was introducing some slides before. To give you a little bit another idea of that is we could think of different importances of cities. So for example, if we have a city located somewhere in a region where we don't have any other cities around, then the city has a high importance. Another city in the same spatial configuration, but the city is bigger, would have the same relative importance because they're a high relative importance because there's no other city there. But maybe a bigger absolute importance because it's a bigger city, so might be maybe more internationally visible, something like that. If we have then the same city sizes like here, but these cities are then smaller neighbors to bigger cities, this importance change. So here we have a smaller relative importance, although this city has the same size like this one because it's neighboring a bigger one. And here we have again this situation, even increasing if it's located in a polycentric region. I have to take a note. So what we did do is we used all the information we have, because we also had the cities categorized as within or outside metropolitan regions. We could differentiate then here, maybe if we look at the top two columns here, comparing this line here as the cities that are located inside metropolitan areas, and then the cities here located outside metropolitan areas. This bar is just the total, so maybe we focus on the comparison of the upper two. So if we look at the medium-sized towns here inside metropolitan areas and outside metropolitan areas, what we see is that inside metropolitan areas, for example, we also have some share of politics for the medium-sized towns. Especially, we have a huge share of economy. We also have huge share. I mean, this is kind of the full range of all the functions for the medium-sized towns located within a metropolitan area. If you compare it with a small-sized town located in an agglomeration, I mean, these are matching. All the data has been, so they are comparable in size. So we do not have any political, so it's the average value for all of the cities. I have to add that. We do not have any political importance of the small-sized town. And also, for example, for the small-sized towns, the importance of culture, for example, also of economy decreased enormously. So from this, these two are really smaller here, and this for science and transport, it's also a decrease, but not as huge as in culture and economy. So if we now compare the same city size inside and outside metropolitan areas, this really begins also to become interesting, because what you can see, the same city size inside metropolitan areas where the cities have like the full range of all the functions, outside metropolitan areas, it's completely different. The political part is completely missing. Also, the science part here is missing here. It's really small. So outside metropolitan areas, what is kind of the most important function outside metropolitan areas is the culture function. And then we have a little bit of the economy function, and maybe also a little bit of transport, but here close to not much, zero almost. So if we then compare the share of these different pies inside and outside metropolitan areas, one could try to deduce something for the question of borrowing size and agglomeration shadow, because we would argue that this is not the same for all of the functions. So for some functions, borrowing size, so being located in to a bigger neighbor in an agglomeration, can be beneficial. So for example, science and transport, let me just see, where is science and transport here? Yeah, science and transport here are much bigger. So borrowing size, when they are located in the same size town within a metropolitan area. So these functions seem to benefit from this proximity within an agglomeration. While we have other functions, for example, economy and culture in small-sized towns here, for example, where we see within the metropolitan area, we have only a smaller part of economy in the same sized town as outside metropolitan area. And also here for the culture. So if you are a small-sized town, you are more likely to have bigger importance for economy and culture if you're not located in an agglomeration than if you're located in an agglomeration. So these functions here in the small-sized towns seem to suffer from an agglomeration shadow, meaning that they are better suited in a smaller city outside an agglomeration. Okay. To go on with that, because we are also doing in geography a lot of maps, we also want to show some of these. And if we are now looking at the spatial structure of the different functions, it also becomes really interesting. We have to keep in mind, we only display the small and medium-sized towns here, so there are no capitals also. I mean, apart from the small capitals, like Andorra. So what we can see here now is the pattern of economy here, the metropolitan subfunction economy, and here the metropolitan subfunction of science in the small and medium-sized towns in Europe. And what you can see here is that a lot of Scandinavian cities are showing a strong functional value within economy, which is also probably a result of Scandinavia not having a lot of large-sized towns. So all the economics happen somewhere in small and medium-sized towns. But interestingly, the pattern in science is something completely different. If you look here, you can clearly see the traditional blue banana in Europe. So where's the science located in Europe in small and medium-sized towns? It's located in these, blue banana, and then also here in the northern part of Italy, apart from some, single cities also in Scandinavia. If we look at transport, it's a little more fuzzy. We have a lot of harbor cities in here, which is kind of logical because harbors need to be at the sea, and also airport cities, of course. And then we have culture. This is interesting because this is really stretching out into the region. And this is also the first time that you can see something ongoing in France and Spain. Going back to this, we do not see lots of things going on here. We have some small cities around Paris, for example, here, where we have a little bit of economic development, and also here. But for example, Spain and also Portugal seem to have a really strong city system focused on the main capital, which is excluded in this map. So seems to be that there's not that much going on. But what you can really see here is that the culture function is really like spreading out into the whole, regional hinterland, not only in the regional, in the metropolitan regions, but also in all of the countryside where we do not have metropolitan regions at all. Okay, coming to the summary here with the subfunction culture is kind of the subfunction which is most important outside metropolitan areas. Economy is clearly also a result of the distribution of the city size or the city system in Scandinavia. Then we have the blue banana for the science function. We have transport focusing on harbor cities partly, and then and also like smaller cities which host airports neighboring to bigger cities. So to summarize all of that, of the two parts that I wanted to present, is we found in the first part that R&D in private sector really is a driver of regionalization. And I think what is interesting is that you could also see that in the European comparison now in the second part, where we have these strong, for example, if you look at the map, the strong distribution throughout the blue banana, but also with regard to the borrowing size effects, where small and medium-sized cities within metropolitan areas are really important, or like hosting a lot of these functions. And economy and culture are more sensitive towards agglomeration shadow effects, at least in the smaller cities. With culture, you can see that throughout Europe that it is like popping up also not only within the metropolitan areas, but throughout Europe as a whole. What is also interesting is you see that the national urban system influences the location of patterns. We plan to do some more analysis on that, but it's not finished yet. So maybe I can update you later. Thank you for your attention.